There is a building in the Arctic where 91 small lights burn in 91 small windows, one for each person who was set on fire on the frozen ground outside. It stands at the edge of the world, in a Norwegian fishing village called Vardø, so far north that for 2 months of the year the sun never rises. In winter, the only light comes from the stars and the snow and those 91 tiny flames, glowing through the darkness like something that refuses to go out. Beneath each window is a name, and beneath each name is a story. Most of those names belong to women, fishermen's wives, midwives, healers, grandmothers. A 12-year-old girl who watched her own mother burned alive, then watched her aunt burned alive, then was dragged into a courtroom and told that if she did not give them more names, she would be next. She gave them 5 names, 5 women she knew, 5 women who were burned on the 20th of March, 1663, in the snow, within sight of the stone fortress where they had been imprisoned. She was 12. What happened in this village over the course of 70 years is one of the most intense persecutions in European history. Not in size, because the numbers are small compared to the great continental purges, but in proportion. In a community of roughly 3,000 people, scattered across 18,000 square miles of frozen coastline, 91 were condemned to death. 140 were put on trial. There was not a single family in the region that was not touched, either as prosecutors, witnesses, or the condemned. Every family. In a place where everyone knew everyone, where your neighbor's face was the face you saw at the fish-drying racks in the morning and at church on Sunday, the accusations came from the people standing next to you. The woman who lent you salt accused you of summoning storms. The man who helped you mend your nets testified that you danced with the devil on the mountain. Your own niece, 12 years old and terrified, said your name in a courtroom because someone told her she would burn if she did not. And then they burned you instead. This story has been buried for 400 years, buried beneath Arctic snow and the silence of a community that did not want to remember what it had done to itself, buried beneath a second trauma, the complete destruction of the village by Nazi bombing during the Second World War, a newer horror that overwrote the older one. Buried so deep that when a memorial was finally built in 2011, most of the people living in Vardø did not even know it had happened. But I know, and now you are going to know. Because what happened in Vardø is not just a story about witches and superstition and a small village going mad in the dark. It is a story about what happens when fear finds a community with no way out. When grief becomes accusation, when neighbors become executioners, when an entire society decides that the only explanation for its suffering is that someone among them must be causing it, and when that someone is almost always a woman. Stay with me, because the deeper we go into this story, the worse it gets. To understand what happened in Vardø, you need to understand where Vardø is, because the geography is not just background. The geography is the reason. Vardø sits at 70 degrees north latitude, above the Arctic Circle, on a small island at the absolute northeastern tip of Norway. It is the easternmost town in Norway, further east than Istanbul, further east than Cairo. If you kept going east from Vardø, the next country you would reach is Russia. If you went north, there is nothing but ice until the pole. In winter, the sun disappears entirely for 2 months. The temperature drops to -30. The wind comes off the Barents Sea at speeds that can knock a grown man off his feet. The darkness is not like the darkness you know. It is total. It is absolute. It is the kind of darkness where you can lose your sense of direction walking from your front door to your neighbor's house 30 feet away. In summer, the opposite happens. The sun never sets. For 2 months, daylight is constant, unbroken, disorienting in a different way. Time loses meaning. Sleep becomes difficult. The world feels unreal, washed in pale gold light that never fades. This is where people lived. This is where they chose to live, because the sea was abundant and the fish were plentiful. And for centuries, the cod that swam in these Arctic waters had made the people of northern Norway not just survivors, but prosperous. The men went out in small boats, sometimes for days at a time, to fish. The women stayed behind and managed everything else. The homes, the children, the drying racks where the fish were preserved, the gardens where what little could grow did grow. It was a hard life, but it was a life, and for generations it worked, until Christmas Eve, 1617. And this is where everything changes. On the 24th of December, 1617, the men of Vardø went to sea. This was not unusual. Fishing on Christmas Eve was common. The cod were running, the weather seemed manageable, and families needed the income. 40 men in 10 boats pushed off from the shore that afternoon. Some of them were fathers who had promised their children they would be home before dark. Some were young men, barely old enough to handle a boat, going out for the first time alongside their older brothers. Some were grandfathers, who had fished these waters for 50 years and knew every current, every hidden rock, every sign the sky could give. They knew this sea. They trusted it the way you trust something you have lived with your entire life. Not completely, not blindly, but enough to go out on it one more time. And then the storm came. Witnesses on shore described it in language that still feels terrifying 400 years later. They said the sea and sky became one. They said it happened suddenly, as if loosened from a bag. One moment the water was rough but manageable. The next moment the wind was screaming, and the waves were mountains, and the boats were gone. All 10 boats, all 40 men, gone. Not gradually, not one by one. All at once, in a single catastrophic moment that took the majority of the village's male population in what felt like a single breath. I want you to imagine what that evening was like on shore. The women standing on the rocks, staring into the darkness, waiting for boats that were not coming back. The children asking when their fathers would be home. The slow, horrible realization that the silence from the sea was not a pause but a permanent answer. 40 men dead. In a community of a few hundred people, this was not a tragedy. It was an amputation. Every family lost someone. Every house had an empty chair. The ratio of women to men shifted overnight from roughly equal to desperately imbalanced. The village was shattered. Economically, socially, emotionally, spiritually shattered. These were people who believed that God controlled the weather, that the natural world operated according to divine will, that storms and calm and fish and famine were all expressions of a higher power's judgment. And so they ask the question that every grieving community asks when disaster strikes without warning or reason. Why? Why us? Why now? Why those men? Why those boats? What did we do to deserve this? And here is where the story turns. Because the answer they arrived at would consume their village for the next 70 years. Someone must have caused it. The storm was not natural. It could not have been natural. It came too fast, too suddenly, too perfectly targeted. Someone summoned it. Someone called it down upon their husbands and fathers and sons. Someone used dark power to murder 40 men on Christmas Eve. A witch. There was a witch among them, and she needed to burn. Now, I need to tell you something that makes this story different from almost every other witch trial in European history. Because the context here is unique, and the context is what turns a tragedy into a horror. Most of the major witch hunts in Europe happened in places with access to information, to legal institutions, to some form of oversight. They were terrible, yes. They were unjust, yes. But they happened in places where at least theoretically someone could intervene. Vardo had none of that. This was the most remote settlement in the entire Norwegian-Danish kingdom. The nearest city of any size was weeks of travel away. Central authorities barely knew Vardo existed, and when they did pay attention, it was only to extract taxes and enforce obedience. The people who held power in Vardo were not Norwegians. They were foreign officials appointed by the Danish-Norwegian crown, men from Scotland, Germany, and Denmark, who had been sent to this frozen outpost to maintain order and Protestant orthodoxy. These were men who had grown up in countries with established traditions of witch hunting. They brought their beliefs with them the way you bring your luggage, and among those beliefs was a particularly dangerous idea. They believed that evil came from the north. This was not a local superstition. This was an established theological position in parts of Europe. Religious scholars had written extensively about how the northern regions of the world were closer to the forces of darkness, how the Arctic was a gateway to demonic influence, how the people who lived in these frozen places were especially susceptible to the devil's power. The Sami people, the indigenous population of northern Scandinavia, were viewed with particular suspicion. Their traditional healing practices, their spiritual connection to the natural world, their refusal to fully convert to Christianity, all of this was interpreted by foreign officials as evidence of a special relationship with Satan. So here is the situation in Vardo after the storm of 1617. A devastated community desperate for answers. Foreign officials already predisposed to see witchcraft in every shadow. A legal framework that had just been updated in 1620 with a new sorcery law that made prosecution easier. An indigenous population that the authorities already considered suspect.